Red Bull just did something that nobody expected before the first race of the season. Hours before the Australian Grand Prix, information began leaking from inside the paddock, and it points to something very unusual inside the RB22. Not a visible upgrade. Not a new bodywork package. Something much harder to detect. Subtle engine deployment changes. Hidden aerodynamic refinements. And a Ford power unit that rivals are already calling the reference of the grid. But here is the part that makes this situation even more interesting. Max Verstappen is suddenly lowering expectations, publicly saying Red Bull might not even fight for the win, which raises a serious question. If the car already looked extremely strong in Bahrain, why would Verstappen say that now? Some teams inside the paddock believe the answer is simple. Red Bull may already be hiding its real pace for Melbourne, because the RB22 arriving in Australia is not a new car. It is something more dangerous, a version that has been quietly optimized in the areas that matter the most in modern Formula One. Energy deployment, straight line efficiency, and race pace consistency. And if those adjustments work the way Red Bull expects, the first Grand Prix of the season could already be decided before the lights even go out. Subscribe to the channel, because what Red Bull has prepared for Australia might only be the beginning. Everyone assumed the RB22 arriving in Melbourne would simply be the same car we saw during the Bahrain tests. Strong, fast, efficient, but predictable. And in Formula One, predictable is usually dangerous for rivals. Because Red Bull rarely changes its philosophy between the test sessions and the first race. They follow a pattern that has worked for years. Launch a car that already performs well. Gather massive amounts of data. Then begin refining the details while everyone else is still trying to understand their own machines. And that appears to be exactly what has happened again. The RB22 that has arrived at Albert Park is not a completely new specification. There is no dramatic bodywork redesign. No massive aerodynamic overhaul. No emergency upgrade package. Instead, Red Bull brought something much more calculated. Refinement. Because the biggest upgrade the car received actually happened earlier, during the Bahrain test sessions. That is when engineers introduced the extreme sidepod concept, combined with a heavily revised floor and a rear section designed specifically to reduce drag while maintaining stability. Those changes already transformed the behavior of the car. The side pods are unusually aggressive, carved deeply underneath to guide airflow toward the floor. The floor itself works as the main performance generator, creating massive ground effect suction while keeping the car stable in high-speed corners. And the rear bodywork is incredibly tight. Everything about this car is built around one goal: efficiency. Less drag on the straights. More stability through medium-speed corners. And maximum traction when the driver hits the throttle. But this is where something interesting starts to appear. Because for Australia, Red Bull did not introduce new visible aerodynamic pieces. Instead, sources inside the paddock say the team focused on extremely small adjustments to the floor edges and cooling configuration. Changes that most people would never notice. But these details matter enormously in Albert Park. This circuit punishes cars that struggle with traction and energy management. There are multiple acceleration zones where drivers go from slow speed corners directly into long straights. Which means the power unit becomes a decisive factor. And this is where the Ford RB22 engine enters the story. During the Bahrain tests, several teams quietly admitted something that immediately caught attention inside the paddock. The Red Bull Ford engine may already be the most efficient power unit on the grid. Not just powerful, efficient. Which is a completely different advantage. Because efficiency means the engine can deploy energy longer, maintain higher speed at the end of the straights, and recover battery power more effectively during braking zones. And that leads to something that most viewers never see during a race: energy strategy. Every lap in Formula One is a constant battle of energy management. Where to harvest power, where to release it, and how much to save for overtaking opportunities. The difference between a well-calibrated system and a poorly optimized one can be several tenths per lap. And according to leaks from engineers following the situation closely, this is exactly where Red Bull focused its work before arriving in Melbourne. Not new hardware, not new engine parts, but new energy maps, new deployment logic, and new overtake modes specifically designed for the stop-and-go nature of Albert Park. And this is the detail that rival teams are watching very carefully. Because when Red Bull starts refining software instead of adding parts, it usually means the car is already very close to its ideal performance window. But here is where the story becomes even more intriguing. Because despite all these indicators, Max Verstappen is not behaving like a driver who expects an easy victory. In fact, his comments just before the Australian Grand Prix surprised many people inside the paddock. And what he said raises an even bigger question about the real performance of the RB22. A question that could completely change how we interpret everything Red Bull is doing right now. But the most revealing detail about Red Bull in Australia is not the car. It is the attitude of Max Verstappen. Because when the reigning champion speaks carefully before a race, people inside Formula One pay attention. Very close attention. Just days before the Australian Grand Prix, Verstappen made a statement that immediately started circulating through the paddock. He said that right now, he does not believe Red Bull is guaranteed to fight for victory. And that sentence surprised many people. Because the data from Bahrain suggested the opposite. The RB22 looked extremely consistent during long runs. The car showed strong balance, excellent tire management, and impressive straight-line efficiency. But Verstappen insisted something was still missing. One more step. One more layer of performance. And when a driver like Verstappen says that, it usually means the team understands something others do not yet see. Because Formula One performance is never about a single number. It is about the complete package. Qualifying speed, race pace, energy deployment, tire degradation, cooling efficiency, and how all those elements behave across an entire race distance. In Bahrain testing, Red Bull looked very strong in long runs. In fact, several analysts pointed out that the RB22 seemed extremely stable when fuel loads increased, which is a very important signal. Because the first race of the season often becomes a strategy battle rather than a pure pace contest. Fuel loads are high. Teams are still learning tire behavior. And reliability always remains a question. In those conditions, consistency often becomes more valuable than raw speed. And according to the information coming from testing, consistency might be Red Bull's strongest weapon right now. But this is where another important factor enters the story. The new FIA monitoring systems. For this season, the governing body has increased scrutiny around two areas that directly affect Red Bull's strengths. Active aerodynamic systems. And energy deployment during overtaking. Both systems are now monitored much more closely, particularly in situations where a car suddenly gains a large speed advantage on the straights. This forced several teams to rethink how they manage their energy release and overtake modes. And Red Bull was one of the teams that had to adapt quickly. Engineers reportedly spent a significant amount of time recalibrating the software that controls the interaction between the ERS system and the aerodynamic modes of the car. Because the regulations now require extremely precise control over how those systems operate together. Too aggressive with deployment, and the system could trigger regulatory questions. Too conservative, and the car loses one of its biggest advantages. So what Red Bull has done is something extremely typical of their engineering culture. They optimized the balance. Energy release is now more progressive. Recovery zones are slightly adjusted. And the overtake mode delivers power in a more controlled way rather than in sudden bursts. These changes might sound small. But on a track like Albert Park, they can define the outcome of the race. Because Melbourne is not just about top speed. It is about traction out of slow corners. It is about maintaining energy through the lap. And it is about having enough deployment available when the race reaches its final stages. Which brings us to another reason why the paddock is watching Red Bull very closely this weekend. The RB22 may not have arrived with a dramatic visual upgrade. But the car that takes the grid in Australia is a more refined machine than the one we saw during the Bahrain tests. Cooling optimized. Energy maps adjusted. Aerodynamic balance slightly improved. All within the same concept? And this is exactly how Red Bull usually builds its advantage during the early races of the season. Not with one massive breakthrough, but with dozens of small improvements that accumulate quietly. Until suddenly, the gap becomes impossible to ignore. But there is still one more piece of this puzzle that almost nobody outside the paddock is talking about yet. A detail related specifically to the Australian circuit. A detail that could explain why Red Bull engineers were so focused on energy deployment before this race. And once you understand that detail, the strategy behind the RB22 in Melbourne starts to make a lot more sense. There is one characteristic of the Australian Grand Prix that makes this entire Red Bull strategy much more interesting. Albert Park punishes cars that waste energy. More than most circuits on the calendar. At first glance the layout looks simple. Fast sections, flowing corners, long straights. But underneath that appearance, the circuit creates a very specific technical challenge. Energy distribution across the lap. Because drivers accelerate aggressively out of several medium and slow speed corners. Then immediately enter long straight sections where energy deployment becomes critical. If a car uses too much electrical energy early in the lap, the battery will be partially empty before reaching the final straight. And that is exactly where drivers become vulnerable. Overtakes often happen there. which means the teams that manage their ERS systems best gain a massive advantage. This is precisely why Red Bull engineers focused so heavily on energy maps before arriving in Melbourne. Not because the engine lacks power. Quite the opposite. The Ford RB22 power unit has already shown extremely strong performance during testing. Several teams inside the paddock consider it one of the most efficient engines currently on the grid. And efficiency is the key word here. Because efficiency allows a team to do something incredibly valuable during a race. Control when the power appears. Instead of simply using maximum deployment everywhere, engineers can choose very specific points of the lap where the energy boost becomes most effective. Out of the slow corners. Midway through the straights. Or precisely when a driver attempts an overtake. That kind of precision is controlled entirely through software. And according to several technical reports circulating inside the paddock, Red Bull has spent the days between Bahrain testing and the Australian Grand Prix refining exactly that. The deployment curves, the recovery timing, and the interaction between the ERS system and the car's aerodynamic modes. Because the regulations around active aerodynamics and energy deployment are now monitored more closely than ever. Teams cannot create extreme speed differentials on the straights without attracting attention from the FIA. So the challenge becomes far more subtle. Instead of a sudden burst of power, engineers must create smoother energy delivery. A progressive increase in speed that stays within regulatory limits but still produces a competitive advantage. And Red Bull has always been exceptionally good at this kind of engineering. Quiet improvements. Invisible advantages. Performance that only becomes obvious once the race distance unfolds. But here is where things become even more intriguing. Because despite all these optimizations, Verstappen continues to insist that the RB22 may still be missing a final piece of performance. A final step. Which raises a very interesting possibility. What if Red Bull is not revealing its full potential yet? What if the current setup in Melbourne is only part of the real picture? Because historically, Red Bull rarely brings its biggest development packages to the very first race of the season. They prefer something much more strategic. Start the season with a strong, balanced car. Collect enormous amounts of data. And then introduce a major development step once the championship battle begins to take shape. Which means the RB22 we see in Australia might only represent the foundation of something much bigger. And if that is true, then the first Grand Prix of the season may reveal something extremely important. Not just which team is fastest, but which team has the most development potential. Because in modern Formula 1, the car that starts the season fastest is not always the one that finishes it on top. And the early signs suggest Red Bull may already be preparing the next stage of this story. A stage that could redefine the balance of power once the championship truly begins.